Organs Without Bodies. Deleuze and Consequences. By Slavoj Zizek. Introduction. Gilles Deleuze was well known for his aversion toward debate. He once, the great proletarian cultural revolution, wrote that when a true philosopher sits in a cafe and hears somebody say, "Let us debate this point a little bit," he jumps up and runs away as fast as possible. He could have quoted as the proof of his attitude the entire history of philosophy. That Plato, the first true metaphysician, wrote dialogues is perhaps the greatest irony in the history of philosophy, since his dialogues never involve a symmetrical exchange of arguments. In the early dialogues, Socrates occupies the position of the one who knows that he knows nothing, and, from it, undermines the presumed knowledge of his partners. In the late ones, the main character does all the talking while the partner's contribution is limited to occasional exclamations like "It is so," "By Zeus, you are right," and so forth. And, instead of bemoaning this fact, one should fully endorse and assume it. As Alain Badiou put it, philosophy is inherently axiomatic, the consequent deployment of a fundamental insight. Hence, all great dialogues in the history of philosophy were so many cases of misunderstanding. Aristotle misunderstood Plato, Thomas Aquinas misunderstood Aristotle, Hegel misunderstood Kant and Schelling, Marx misunderstood Hegel, Nietzsche misunderstood Christ, Heidegger misunderstood Hegel. Precisely when one philosopher exerted a key influence upon another, this influence was without exception a productive misreading. Did not the entirety of analytic philosophy emerge from misreading the early Wittgenstein? Another complication that pertains to philosophy concerns the fact that, often, other disciplines take over, at least part of, the normal role of philosophy. In some of the 19th century nations like Hungary or Poland, it was literature that played the role of philosophy, that of articulating the ultimate horizon of meaning of the nation in the process of its full constitution. In the United States today, in the conditions of the predominance of cognitivism and brain studies in philosophy departments, most of continental philosophy takes place in departments of comparative literature, cultural studies, English, French, and German. As they are now saying, if you analyze a rat's vertebra, you are doing philosophy. If you analyze Hegel, you belong to Komplet. In Slovenia during the 1970s, the dissident philosophy took place in sociology departments and institutes. There is also the other extreme of philosophy itself taking over the tasks of other academic, or even non-academic, practices and disciplines. Again, in the former Yugoslavia and some other socialist countries, philosophy was one of the spaces of the first articulation of dissident political projects. It effectively was politics pursued with other means, as Althusser put it apropos of Lenin. So, where did philosophy play its normal role? One usually invokes Germany. However, is it not already a commonplace that the extraordinary role of philosophy in German history was grounded in the belatedness of the realization of the German national political project? As Marx already put it, taking his cue from Heine, Germans had their philosophical revolution, German idealism, because they missed the political revolution, which took place in France. Is, then, there a norm at all? The closest one comes to it is if one looks upon the anemic established academic philosophy like Neo-Kantianism 100 years ago in Germany, or French Cartesian epistemology, Leon Brunswick, etc., of the first half of the 20th century, which was precisely philosophy at its most stale, academic, irrelevant, and dead. No wonder that, in 2002, Luc Ferry, a neo-Kantian, was nominated the Minister of Education in the new centre-right French government. What if, then, there is no normal role? What if it is exceptions themselves that retroactively create the illusion of the norm they allegedly violate? What if not only, in philosophy, exception is the rule, but also what if philosophy, the need for authentic philosophical thought, arises precisely in those moments when, other, parts constituents of the social edifice cannot play their proper role? What if the proper space for philosophy is these very gaps and interstices opened up by pathological displacements in the social edifice? For this, and other, reasons, Alain Badiou is right in rejecting Lacan's anti-philosophy. In fact, when Lacan endlessly varies the motif of how philosophy tries to fill in the holes, to present a totalizing view of the universe, to cover up all the gaps, ruptures, and inconsistencies, say, in the total self-transparency of self-consciousness, and how, against philosophy, psychoanalysis asserts the constitutive gap/rupture/inconsistency, and so on and so forth, he simply misses the point of what the most fundamental philosophical gesture is, not to close the gap, but, on the contrary, to open up a radical gap in the very edifice of the universe, the ontological difference, the gap between the empirical and the transcendental, in which neither of the two levels can be reduced to the other. As we know from Kant, transcendental constitution is a mark of our human finitude and has nothing to do with creating reality. On the other hand, reality appears to us only within the transcendental horizon. So we cannot generate the emergence of the transcendental horizon from the ontic self-development of reality. A Lacanian book on Deleuze cannot ignore all these facts. Consequently, Organs Without Bodies is not a dialogue between these two theories but something quite different, an attempt to trace the contours of an encounter between two incompatible fields. An encounter cannot be reduced to symbolic exchange. What resonates in it, over and above the symbolic exchange, is the echo of a traumatic impact. While dialogues are commonplace, encounters are rare. So, why Deleuze? In the past decade, Deleuze emerged as the central reference of contemporary philosophy. Notions like resisting multitude, nomadic subjectivity, the anti-Oedipal critique of psychoanalysis, and so on are the common currency of today's academia, not to mention the fact that Deleuze more and more serves as the theoretical foundation of today's anti-globalist left and its resistance to capitalism. Organs Without Bodies here goes against the current. Its starting premise is that, beneath this Deleuze, the popular image of Deleuze based on the reading of the books he co-authored with Félix Guattari, there is another Deleuze, much closer to psychoanalysis and Hegel, a Deleuze whose consequences are much more shattering. This book therefore starts by discerning the inner tension of Deleuze's thought between anti-Oedipus and the logic of sense, between the Deleuze who celebrated the productive multitude of becoming against the reified order of being and the Deleuze of the sterility of the incorporeal becoming of the sense event. I.e. consequences. This tension are then deployed with regard to three principal domains: science, art, cinema, and politics. It is not difficult to discern in these three domains the good old triad of the true, the beautiful, and the good. With regard to science, the possible links between psychoanalysis, on one side, and cognitivism and the brain sciences, on the other side, are explored. With regard to cinema, the analysis of a series of formal procedures in classical and contemporary Hollywood films, from Hitchcock to Fight Club, is used to deploy how the notion of the organ without a body, which inverts the Deleuzian notion of the body without organs, plays a key role not only in formal analysis but also with regard to the new figures of revolutionary subjectivity. And, finally, in relation to politics, the deadlock and impotence of the popular Deleuzian politics is exposed, and the contours of a different Deleuzian politics are outlined. The target of critique here involves those aspects of Deleuzianism that, while masquerading as Deleuze radical chic, effectively transform Deleuze into an ideologist of today's digital capitalism. During the shooting of David Lean's Dr. Zhivago in a Madrid suburb in 1964, a crowd of Spanish statists had to sing the Internacional in a scene involving a mass demonstration. The movie team was astonished to discover that they all knew the song and were singing it with such a passion that the Francoist police intervened, thinking that they were dealing with a real political manifestation. Even more, when, late in the evening, the scene was to take place in darkness, people living in the nearby houses heard the echoes of the song. They opened up bottles and started to dance in the street, wrongly presuming that Franco had died and the socialists had taken power. This book is dedicated to those magic moments of illusory freedom, which, in a way, were precisely not simply illusory, and to the hopes thwarted by the return to normal reality. Especially with regard to the philosophical aspect of the book, I would like to thank Adrian Johnston for many helpful critical suggestions.